Hello, everyone. Welcome to our core certification Best Practices for Success webinar. I want to thank all of you for joining us for however long you're able to join us. And those of us that listen to this recording, thank you so much. We want to just acknowledge the fact that life has changed and our reality is different. A lot of us are teleworking or doing the best we can given the circumstances. So I just want to thank you for your time on this webinar and let you know that CAQH core staff are very aware that circumstances have changed for all of you. Next slide. So there are different ways to access the slides for this webinar. You can see there in the red box that you can access the slides right now if you'd like to go through the slides along with us. If not, you can just watch the presentation and then in the next day or so, we'll send you the slides as well as the recording so you can review at your convenience. Next slide. During this webinar, we're going to talk a little bit about CAQH core. We'll walk through core certification, the steps for certification, and also available resources. And then we'll give you a program update on our new certification efforts. And then we'll leave plenty of time at the end for your questions. Next slide. I'd like to introduce our first speaker, Senior Manager Taha Anjarwalla, who is going to cover the first few sections of our webinar. Hello, Taha.
Thank you, Jessica, and I hope everyone's doing well and staying safe. So I'd like to kind of begin and provide an overview of CAQH core before I dive into discussing more details about the certification program. So core is a nonprofit collaboration of stakeholders, including health plans, providers, vendors, clearinghouses, government agencies, and associations that really work together to improve healthcare interoperability for both administrative and clinical activities. Our mission is really to drive the creation and adoption of healthcare operating rules that really serve as business guidelines that support a variety of standards and used to describe how information flows from provider to payer and everyone in between. We are the designated operating rule author by the Secretary of Health and Human Services. So we have that designation, and we continue to write operating rules to fulfill our requirements. If you look on the visual on the slide, it really illustrates CORE's model for operating rule development, which really takes a holistic and integrated approach. So starting from a stage process of identifying industry needs and gaps that really involves in-depth research on potential business areas and gaps for where we would like to develop operating rules. We really work together to bring industry minds to collaborate, develop, and vote on requirements for operating rules. CORE then really promotes operating rules after they've been published and developed by building awareness through education. And next, CORE offers a certification program for organizations to really test and demonstrate conformance to those rules that were developed and published so that adoption can be tracked. And the certification program will be the topic, and we'll be providing more detail on that program in particular on today's webinar. And lastly, we continue to monitor industry needs for future development and assess areas and requests to update existing rules. So that cycle continues as we look to see where we want to go in the future. On the next slide, this slide kind of shows the various touch points across the revenue cycle that core operating rules have an impact on. And you can see, starting with patient encounter, we've developed operating rules on eligibility and benefit verification and prior authorization. And as we move across the continuum, as the provider submits a claim, we have rules that acknowledge claim submission and claim acknowledgement, and then also being able to check the status of that claim. And then down to the payment of a particular patient visit or patient encounter, we have rules that ensure that payments can be delivered via EFT, and then there's an electronic remittance. And then lastly, the engagement of health plan membership. So we have rules that touch member enrollment and also premium payment from an employer. So you can see the bold the business processes that are highlighted in bold are the rules that we have published to date. And then the ones that are shaded are the ones that we are looking forward to developing in the future. On the next slide, I'd like to kind of talk about our movement from phases to transactions, which we've discussed earlier on previous town halls, but historically, all of CAQH Core's operating rules have been organized by phases in which each rule set builds on prior rules in order to encourage feasible and incremental progress across the industry. So, we've reached a point where we've developed operating rules for 7 of the key administrative transactions used in healthcare. And in 2019, our core board agreed to reorganize our operating rule set structure to really align our rules with the business processes they support. So rather than eventually reaching, phase 10, 11, 12, 13 of our operating rules, we've developed a new and flexible framework organized around the business process of these transactions, where new requirements can be easily added and outdated requirements can be removed. And this reorganization really supports the eases implementation burden by not requiring organizations to be certified on prior phases before they can implement new phases of those rules. So on this slide, we kind of laid out how our rules have been historically organized by phase. If you look at the column on the left-hand side of the screen, you can see some of the business processes are split across phase, while in other cases, multiple business processes are included in the same phase. So if you look at phase 4, that rule has 4 business processes that it addresses. So if you look on the right-hand side of the screen, you can see kind of our new rule set structure, which organizes transactions by the 7 healthcare business processes that our rules address. And so I would like to point out that all of our existing operating rules, we're planning to move those into the 7 categories seen on the right, and and no substantive changes will be made to any of those operating requirements. We're just essentially just reorganizing the rules to align with the business processes they support. So on the next slide, I'd like to now talk about course certification. So course certification, so in 2005, CAQH Core began developing operating rules, and in 2007, Core launched course certification in order to support operating rule implementers that and having a means to voluntarily validate and demonstrate conformance to the rules that they've implemented to ensure that their systems are up to date and can validate the implementation of those rules. And the certification program was developed by industry for industry, really through a transparent and multi-stakeholder process, which follows the same process that the operating rules were developed by. Course certification offers cost savings, industry recognition, and market advantage for organizations such as health plans and vendors and providers that essentially any organization that exchange administrative healthcare information. The certification program is designed to ensure that IT systems and products are aligned with federally recognized and industry-developed operating rules and underlying standards. So currently, certification is now available across all sets of published operating rules that I covered on the previous slides, and they cover transactions such as eligibility, claims, claim status, healthcare payments, and prior authorization. And one of the key components that makes core certification really valuable is the aspect of certification testing. And testing not only requires adherence to implementation of policy at a policy level, but actually requires organizations to validate conformance via transaction-based, so actually exchanging eligibility transactions with 270, 271, and it's creating connectivity via a third-party testing partner. We'll outline more details on these specifics of testing requirements later on in the presentation, but I wanted to highlight that's what is a unique aspect for certification program. So essentially, these elements are really the foundation as to why the core certification program is really a gold standard for the industry. We see and we've heard from a lot of organizations that the value of the core CO really gives confidence to organizations and their executive staff that they've gone through an industry-driven, comprehensive, and non-biased independent process to ensure adherence to operating rules and underlying standards. So moving on to the next slide, We're happy to announce that we've awarded a total of 370 core seals to date, and we've highlighted a few of those organizations that have received certifications on the slides that you can see. And, if you look at the pie charts, and looking at the true impact core certification has on the nation's healthcare system, we look and track and measure the amount of covered lives that really benefit from the value that the operating rules have through core certification. So if you look at for phases 1 and 2 of the commercially insured market, we can see that 80% of commercially insured lives really should be receiving benefits supported by the core operating rules. And if you look at the publicly insured, we can see that over 50% of publicly insured lives are covered by core certified plans. And transitioning to phase 3, which covers the EFT and ERA, so payment and remittance operating rules, you can see that, adoption is definitely growing in this segment, with 59% of commercially insured being benefited for payment and remittance rules, and 40% of publicly insured covered by certified plans for phase 3. And then looking at the dental industry adoption, you can see this adoption remains steady, and we're continuing to look and evaluate in efforts to build upon this. But you can see across phases 1 through 3, 47% of the commercially insured lives are covered by a certified dental plan. On the next slide, I like to highlight, core certification is really a good way to prepare for potential compliance reviews, and many of the reasons why, what we hear in feedback based on organizations like go through the certification process is that they look to core certification is that, they like the idea that there's objective third-party testing, proving whether or not an organization is conforming to operating rules and standards, as that they're meant to be used and implemented according to the guidelines that we publish. And you can see, they've also discovered, there's ways to find efficiencies and administrative cost savings through implementation of rules and electronic standards. And looking at index estimates, you can see there's a $9.4 billion savings potential for the industry as a whole by moving in this direction. And I like to also highlight that CMS is now actively engaged in auditing organizations as part of their compliance review program and their complaint-driven process. And we see core certification as a tool to help organizations prepare for these potential compliance reviews and audits through, our comprehensive certification testing platform and application and review process. We think core certification is positioned to help organizations assess, demonstrate, document, and certify conformance with federally mandated standards and operating rules, and works to build confidence for organizations in the event of audit. You can think about it as using TurboTax, going to H&R Block or a third-party accountant to help with your taxes. It's really good practice to find somebody outside your organization to check your work and make sure you did it right. And core certification is that kind of check for operating rules and standards. So on the next slide, I like to kind of talk about, enforcement mechanisms within the certification program to ensure, there's a large footprint. I talked about the percent of covered lives impacted by certification. So there's this large footprint of core certified entities now in the marketplace. And we really want to ensure that there's ongoing monitoring and compliance in the industry across all training partners to ensure that those operating rule efficiencies can be benefited by all training partners, both upstream and downstream. So a component of core certification is that there's an enforcement policy in place that all certified organizations must adhere to, in addition to not only just operating rule and testing requirements in order to become core certified. And this enforcement policy applies to any core certified entity, including certified plans, vendors, clearinghouses, and providers. And this policy follows a complaint-driven but collaborative process with focusing on remediating issues instead of issuing penalties. The enforcement policy really helps benefit the industry by taking a self-policing and self-reporting approach. Really, we are really working to empower the industry, to collaborate and receive and maximize the benefits of the operating rules. And we really think this approach really allows end-to-end monitoring of conformance across all training partners to help identify gaps within the system. And the way the enforcement policy works is if you believe that one of your trading partners is non-compliant with the operating rules, we have several resources available to help guide and navigate getting that organization up to compliance. For example, we have letter templates available to help you start a collaborative dialogue with non-compliant trading partners, to a formal complaint form where you can document instances of those non-compliance activities, to initiate a complaint to court, where we can then help to facilitate remediation efforts. Feel free to contact us if you'd like to learn more or have detailed questions about our enforcement activity. And we do have on our website a detailed page that lists all the available resources to help help organizations engage with enforcement activities. So on the next slide, I'd like to kind of move in and talk about, I've talked about the program as a whole, the key components and policies, what makes certification program, but what are the different steps required in order to pursue certification, and what are those steps needed? So essentially, there are 4 steps that organizations go through when undergoing certification. The first component really outlines, ensuring that organizations are taking the appropriate steps to evaluate their systems, understanding the operating requirements, and execute any system remediations needed in order to implement their systems according to the rule requirements that they're pursuing. So that first step is really evaluating systems and planning for the certification. Component 2 really outlines where you've committed to certification, and we have a official pledge document that organizations have to sign to really formally communicate your organization's intent to publicly pursue certification. And we recognize these organizations on our website to really kick this off as a formal intent to pursue certification. Component 3 really addresses certification testing. And this component really outlines steps and provides resources to help organizations navigate through the testing process. Certified organizations seeking certification work with our core authorized testing vendor to really perform tests based on specific testing criteria, which we've developed and drafted. And organizations will work through different types of test scripts, which we'll hear about later on in our presentation, to really ensure that they've implemented the rules correctly. Lastly, our 4th component outlines the steps organizations need to take when applying for the core seal. So there are various forms that are needed from organizations, and also the payment and application fee. So after you complete testing, we'll then complete a thorough review of all the application materials submitted by an organization, and based upon the decision of the review, we would then issue and distribute a core seal accordingly to ensure an organization has really fully and comprehensively undergone testing, and we've evaluated all the necessary materials in order to issue that core certification seal. On the next slide, this slide really highlights the best path approach that your organization can take when implementing and certifying on a particular set of the core operating rules. And we've kind of mapped this on the slide. So you can see that this approach starts with an assessment and reading of the operating rules themselves at number 1. And then you would want to follow this by looking at identifying any internal systems and any sort of gaps to ensure you align your systems with the operating rules. And we have several resources such as our analysis and planning guide to really walk you through that. And then next, we would want to ensure that you engage internal resources to start the project. So you may have to coordinate with different resources across your organization. So you may have to coordinate with your IT team to ensure that if you've implemented connectivity properly, or if you're doing prior authorization, ensuring you're coordinating across business teams to ensure you're able to meet certain timeframes in that sense. The 4th step would be to then begin and remediate your systems by either working internally within your organization, or if you've outsourced some of the requirements, operating rules or standards to trading partners, you would need to then coordinate and work with your revenue cycle vendors or clearinghouses to ensure that items have been implemented according to the rule requirements. So after your systems have been remediated, the next step would be to actually pursue certification. So that way your organization can assure, validate, and showcase efforts with operating rule implementation to really ensure that benefits and ROI can be realized. The certification process, which I talked about those 4 steps on the last slide, really then comes into play where you can demonstrate your commitment to certification. Step 8, and then step 6, and then lastly, one of the new program updates to core certification is looking at step 7 is recertification. And so we would want to ensure that as systems get updated, mergers and acquisitions occur, technology evolves, and new rule requirements get made, that there's ongoing conformance and monitoring of implementation of operating requirements. And I'll be talking more about that recertification program later on in the presentation. So with that, I think I'm going to hand it over to Adam Nichols, our core senior associate, to talk more in detail about some of the components that I talked about, such as testing, some of the resources that are valuable for certification and implementation of the operating rules, and some best practices and tips and tricks that we've heard from certified organizations that have gone through this experience in the past.
Thanks, Taha. Today, I'd like to dive into the core certification process with what resources are available to you as an organization testing for core certification. So on the slide, you can see we have a host of FAQs with hundreds for each operating rule. These questions that we receive from organizations going through the implementation and certification process were submitted through our core email inbox. As we would see both common themed and technical questions come in, we would then develop and turn those questions into FAQs. So these FAQs consist of real-world interpretation or assessment questions on the operating rules or certification process. We would then have broken down into a question and answer format where you can search by keywords or specific topics. For example, core certification FAQs include topics around applicable core rule requirements or for different stakeholders, or how the operating rule requirements can be outsourced by organizations. Next slide, please. So looking at this slide, during the pre-certification and system evaluation, organizations should review and understand the requirements of the operating rules and scope of resources needed to adopt and implement the rules. A very important resource that CAQH Core offers is the Analysis and Planning Guide. And we offer these for every phase 1, 2, 3, 4, and now 5. And there is a separate guide for each phase. These guides have separate tools within it, so not only can you do a quick assessment where you would do a simple checks of yes or no, identifying if a general operating rule applies, such as does my organization do real-time or batch. Further, the guide offers drill down tools where you can check operating rule requirements line by line, determining whether or not they apply. Is it a business impact? Is it a technical impact? And really helps you identify remediation strategies such as making a software change, a business process change, or even education or communication opportunity where you may need to engage with another department within your organization or possibly a trading partner. This tool helps you map touch points between systems and business processes to help streamline implementation of the operating rules. All of our tools resources are free. You can access them via our website. These tools can be accessed before you start the formal core certification process. Next slide, please. So after having identified and resolved any necessary gaps in preparation for core certification testing, an organization can move forward with creating a testing account under a CAQH Core authorized testing vendor. Further, once a core certification testing account has been created, the core team will offer a walkthrough with that organization in navigating the test site. Next slide, please. So looking at this slide, after having created a testing account, there are 3 different types of testing components that apply to the core certification testing. First, to start off, there's transaction-based tests, which involve setting up a connection with our authorized CAQH Core third-party testing vendor and testing for the transactions associated with that specific phase for which you are pursuing. Second is the uploading documentation, which requires that organization to upload appropriate documentation applicable to the operating roles. Examples of that would include companion guides, communication log files, and notices of any regularly scheduled downtimes there. Last but not least are the attestation-based tasks, which involve attesting for current or planned conformance to the operating rules for which they are testing. Moving on to the next slide. So once you have a good understanding of the testing tasks that are applicable to your business, establishing connectivity is really the next best recommended step in the testing process. When testing, CORE recommends that the use of an XDOT 509 digital certificate over SSL TLS when establishing connectivity with the CAQH Core authorized testing vendor. The use of the digital certificates reduces the implementation cost and complexity. It really follows best practices for security. Next slide. So on this slide, we're looking at a transaction-based testing task. These testing tasks can either be a pass or fail. And if failed, the testing task can be taken as many times as it takes to pass. You can think of the testing as an open book, with not only being able to test an unlimited number of times before you pass, but having free and immediate access to the operating rules and tools CAQH Core provides on our website. Next slide, please. So when testing for core certification, there may or may not be certain tasks, testing tasks in particular, that are not applicable to your business. If a task does not apply to your business, you can add an explanation as to why this task would be out of scope within the notes and comments section within that specified task. I'll now hand the call back to Jessica, and thank you.
Thank you so much, Adam, and also thank you, Taha, for your presentations. Let's go ahead and launch the first polling question. We'd like to learn from you, for those of you who have pursued core certification or who are thinking about it, which of these reasons listed are the leading your decision making? And feel free to check as many of these as are appropriate. We are trying to, always learn from all of you so that we can keep our program up to date and nimble. So I am going to give this just a few more seconds to get feedback. And then I will ask my colleague Daphne, as appropriate, if she can share the results. And I think we'll take just a moment here. I always find these results interesting. So for Taha or Adam, I think the top result there is definitely not a surprise, right? People want to make sure that they're doing things the way that the law intends them to. Do you have any other insights on this polling question?
Yeah, so I think it really aligns to kind of the feedback that we hear. We always ask our organizations, what are the key drivers, and to your point, Jessica, ensuring that they're meeting federal requirements is definitely a top one. But more interestingly, organizations really want to take the next step, and especially with some of our voluntary rules, and be market leaders in implementing some of the non-mandated rules. So it's interesting to see that in place and kind of some of the key drivers there.
Yeah, you're absolutely right, Taha. It was nice to see those numbers high up too.
Yep.
And with that said, I'm just gonna pass it back to you, Taha, to keep going with our next presentation.
Thanks, Jessica. So next, I'd like to kind of talk about some key program updates to certification, and a lot of these are new, and I'd like to spend some time today to kind of discuss that in more detail. So one of the biggest new requirements that we're launching is recertification. So essentially in 2019, the core board approved adding in a recertification requirement for core certification, and really to align, with our new operating rule structure, and also, until this year, really core certification reflected a single snapshot in time, whereby some of our certifications are now over 10 to 12 years old, since we first launched the program in 2007. So, by requiring organizations to now routinely recertify their conformance with applicable operating rules, we can now ensure that organizations are really adhering to the most recently updated rule requirements as we look into the future and make updates to rules. And as recertification, also, supports the market needs as technology evolves, mergers and acquisitions occur, and health IT systems upgrade. And so, really, recertification is a way to ensure that we're meeting the industry as the market changes over time. So on the next slide, I'd like to kind of talk about, what are some of the key impacts and policies that we've established for recertification and what that may mean to your organization. So the first item to keep in mind is that any updates to the core operating rules will now be incorporated within the recertification process, and at a minimum, entities will have to implement versions of operating rules that have been published 24 months or 2 years prior to their certification renewal date. So what does this mean? So as organizations approach their recertification date, they must consider and evaluate whether these implement new or updated operating rule requirements to recertify. In terms of timelines, core certified entities will be required to recertify every 3 years. Recertification renewals may occur anytime during the calendar year based off the initial year of core certification. So essentially, after communicating an organization's intent to recertify, recertification testing must be completed within 180 days. And if there's a lapse in renewing a certification, core will proceed engaging in an organization and decertification. So really important timelines to keep in mind as you go through the recertification process. And one of the goals of recertification is really to allow the opportunity for organizations to align and recertify across multiple operating rules set at once. So, currently we have a lot of organizations that are certified across, phases 1 to 3, which impact eligibility, claim status, EFT, and ERA, those transactions. So we really want to align all those certifications, and a lot of those organizations certified across different years. So really bring all those certifications together at once. And one of the things that we've done in order to accelerate and streamline the recertification process, we've reduced the number of test cases required for recertification testing to kind of ease that burden, but also keep the comprehensive nature of certification testing in mind to really help streamline the recertification activities in order to ensure all sets of operating rules can be recertified at once. So on the next slide, I'd like to kind of talk about a little bit about the step-by-step process for recertification. And essentially, this really follows a similar approach to the step-by-step process for original certification, with a little bit of differences. One, the first step really is, again, you want to plan and evaluate your systems for recertification to accommodate, if there are any new versions of operating rules that have been implemented, you'll want to take those in mind and execute any necessary in-system updates as part of that process. The second step would be to apply for recertification. So when you come upon your recertification year, you have to communicate and apply, communicate your intent and submit the application that you're applying for certification. Our third step is really to engage in recertification testing. And again, I talked about, you will have a reduced number of test cases, and we'll outline those in our certification test suites. And, you'll have an idea of what exact tests you'll be needed to engage in recertification. And then lastly, the fourth step would be the seal renewal process. So this would be after completing testing and submitting all the different application forms and paperwork, we'll review all the documents and issue your renewal of your core seal accordingly. So essentially, it really follows the same step-by-step process that we've outlined in certification to really ensure that there's parallels between core certification and the recertification process. So on the next slide, I'd like to kind of now talk about, I'm sure the big question in mind for those organizations that are already core certified is like, when do I actually have to begin recertification? What are those expectations? So we've developed an approach to really balance recertification to ensure that older certifications are the first to become updated, but also balance keeping in mind, resource requirements that may be needed to align and recertify operating rules at one time. So the process that we've taken and approach we've taken is, as core certified organizations, we will require recertification, but we're taking approach where we'll be using a base date to align when you must recertify by. And what I mean by that is, for example, if your organization achieved core certification for phases 1 and 2 in 2010, and in phase 3 in 2015, we'll actually take your most recent core certification year, so in this example, 2015, and we'll use that to set your recertification date. And then if you take a look at the chart on this slide, you can then determine the year that you would have to recertify by. So if that last certification was awarded in 2015, we would then require that your organization complete the recertification process by end of 2022. So it really varies depending on your organization and your certifications, but we really try to take that balanced approach in deciding, those recertification dates. And you can see we've definitely tried to give the industry more than 1 year implementation period, especially for this older certification. So, that first round of wave of recertification would be by end of 2021. So a good year and a half for some of those organizations that may be earlier in the process to recertify that their systems are conforming to the operating rules. So on the next slide, we've kind of highlighted a variety of resources that are available now and some of the resources that we have coming soon to really help organizations navigate recertification. So available now, we've made updates to our website, and we'll be also making available today's webinars to outline some of the key policies, processes, and steps that are required for recertification. And then in Q2, we plan to make available a variety of email communications that you can expect from us related to the updates to our rule structure and our recertification program. We'll be providing more on-demand content. So, webinars that you can, view and pass on to different people in your organization, so they'll be available at any time as you have time to watch and learn. We'll also be creating a lot of FAQs around recertification to really guide the industry on some of the most commonly asked questions. We'll make sure that those are available as questions come in hand. And then lastly, I'd like to point out that, core staff will really engage with every single core certified organization and do one-on-one outreach to really educate you on specific benefits and impact to your organization, such as, when your recertification date may be, what impacts will be to how that will impact your organization. And we plan to begin that outreach in starting in Q2 of this year. So expect that to come. So really, we're doing our best to really educate and create awareness around recertification as we move forward in the year. So on the next slide, outside of recertification, I'd like to kind of highlight another kind of update to to the certification program is that we've kind of redesigned our core certification seals to align with our transition to transaction-based or business process-based operating rules that I kind of highlighted at the beginning of the webinar. So we'll be sunsetting our phase-based certification seals that were really designed to communicate the phase of certification achieved and also reference, the organization's stakeholder type. And we've designed new seals to really clearly communicate, the business processes which an organization has achieved certification for, and also will maintain for recertification. So you can see on the slide, what kind of our older seals look like and what some of the new seals, the redesign has been. So as part of our outreach efforts, as we engage organizations in recertification conversations, we'll also be providing updates, your organization updated core seals and new branding guidelines as we engage in communication on recertification. So expect those communications to come out in the near future. So with that, I know we talked about a lot and highlighted some of the key changes, but we're really excited and looking forward to implementing these and having conversations with the organizations to really educate and get everyone up to speed on the changes that we're making. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Jessica, I believe, for our next polling question.
Thank you, Taha. So we're going to do 2 polling questions, and then we'll get started with our Q&A. So this first question helps us know what tools you use and rely on. So please go ahead and select all that apply, whether it's our implementation tools, webinars, information on our website, our on-demand tutorials, which is something that we started fairly recently, and then direct outreach to our incredible certification team. So go ahead, and I am really hoping webinars gets a couple of clicks since I'd like to keep my job. This is a poll that will, it's for internal purposes. So thank you so much for your feedback. And then we will also, Daphne, when you get a chance, let's go ahead and launch the 3rd polling question. And this is another type of question that helps us with our planning efforts to know whether you are contemplating core certification this year or if you need more information. And of course, if you're already certified, you don't need to answer this polling question, and we'll reach out to you depending on where you are with core recertification. Let's give this a few more seconds. And Taha, just to prepare you, there are quite a few questions for our Q&A portion, but I think they're just really helpful clarifying questions. So let's go ahead and poll. Let's go to our Q&A. So a few of the questions that came in reference the CMS enforcement program. And before I let you talk a little bit about it, Taha, I want to remind folks or let people know that last year in the summer, we had 2 webinars with CMS where they discussed their enforcement program. So I just want to let you know those webinars, the slides, and also the recording are available on our website free of charge. So feel free to review if you need a lot of information. Can you, Taha, can you give folks a little bit of information about that CMS program?
Yep. So I believe, so along those lines, CMS announced their compliance review program where they're engaging in active audit, I believe, for health plans, clearinghouses, and also including providers on the mix, where they're selectively randomly auditing different organizations on compliance to operating rules, standards, and code sets that are all mandated by HIPAA or ACA. And so that's what that program is doing. So one of the key things from a certification perspective is that, we help organizations, help prepare for those audits. So ensuring that you've tested and implemented those rules correctly, and also the standards that they support. So that's one thing that we help with. And also another thing is CMS is also engaged in complaint-driven process. So if a provider or an organization submits a complaint through the asset tool, which is we had those webinars in the past year that kind of walks through that process. But organizations can submit complaints of non-conformance via to CMS on that tool. So they also investigate compliance in that. So we've really facilitated and helped organizations out, especially those that are core certified, to really walk through that process, help them ensure how they've implemented operating rules. So we've definitely provided that audit support as CMS has engaged within audits and providing support for core certified organizations.
Thank you, Taha. So we got a couple of different questions regarding our certification fees. So there were questions, you know, what are the fees? Do you charge more depending on how many times you test, especially if you have to retest? So I just wanted to kind of lump a few of those questions together so you could give us one answer.
Yep. So, so our certification fees are really specific to your stakeholder type and your net annual revenue. So they can range between, you know, $6,000 to $9,000 per set of for every phase of operating rules that you certify on. As far as testing goes, there's no fee for testing, so you can test as many times as you want, but it's only when you actually submit the application to pursue certification is where we collect fees. So there are certain organizations that are probably exempt from fees, such as government associate, like state and local agencies they don't have to pay fees. So we do have a detailed list of our certification fees on our website, and we also be happy to provide those who are interested in learning more about the fees. We'd be happy to follow up with you later.
Thanks, Taha. So I'm going to lump another set of questions together. I think these are very specific recertification questions. So one was, you know, how does an organization know what year they certified? And then also when the communication comes out about recertification, who in the organization receives it?
Yep, so that's a really good question. So we have a record of every single certification date for organizations. So once we engage with your organization on our one-on-one outreach and our emails, we'll be providing details of, you know, your certification years and certification dates, so that you have clear idea on you know, when your organization will be expected to recertify. As far as who will be outreaching to, we have a list of certification contacts from each organization. But you know, if you send us an email at core@caqh.org and you'd like to be added to that outreach list, we'd be more than happy to ensure that you're part of those communications.
Great. Yeah, and in general, if we didn't get to your question specifically, I tried to lump some of these, but if we didn't get to your question specifically, yeah, please send us an email and we will try to respond in more detail. So we've got a couple more questions. So one is, what is the usual timeline for the certification process, and what do you anticipate will be the time for recertification? How long will it take to get through it?
Yep. So Adam, you want to take the first part?
Yep. So typically, core certification, as far as the end-to-end goes, is from 3 to 6 months, depending on the number of resources that are applied or that your organization has in order to engage. So we typically see that from the beginning of the first component to the last component is within that time frame. Again, we've had organizations finish in a few weeks. We've had organizations finish in just a couple months. So, but the typically it's about 3 to 6.
Yep, and based on conversations we've had in terms of recertification, based on conversations we've had with organizations, they expect, you know, that same 180 days, you know, up to 6 month timeline to occur for recertification. So, but you know, we've also recognized that, you know, resources may be different and things may be impacted. So we're definitely willing to work with organizations and ensuring to, especially that first round of recertification, to ensure that we're meeting the timeline of your organization. But on average, we think it'll be the same process of 3 to 6 months.
So Taha, you may have just answered this next question, but I'm going to ask it anyway, just in case. So the question is if an organization's unable to complete the recertification process in the 180-day window, will they be decertified?
So we would definitely work with your organization on a, you know, case-by-case process. You know, we can work to see, if you have implementation plan in place, what we can do to work with extensions. So there are different things that we could do to work with your organization to ensure, as long as you have a plan in place, to work with you on extending that window.
Yeah, and down the line, we're planning on doing some further education on this, so you have a better sense out there, what will this testing entail, so you know what's coming. And then I think we have one last question. So what actions has CAQH Core taken in instances of non-compliance with certification, and do you share that information with other organizations or other external government entities such as CMS?
So I highlighted and talked about the core enforcement policy several during the presentation. So we definitely had some inquiries related to enforcement against certified entities. So we've actually worked with the person who filed the complaint, and also the certified organization to that collaborative dialogue to ensure the organization has updated and implemented those rules appropriately. So we've definitely worked in that direction. But for those non-certified organizations, we've provided recommendations and approach to the person filing the complaint and directed them to the appropriate authority of where they can submit complaints to in reporting instances of non-conformance.
That makes sense. Thank you, Taha, and thanks all of you for submitting so many questions. We appreciate that. Let's go on to the next slide. So here is some information about what CAQH Core does and the value of becoming a CAQH Core participant. There's a specific part of our website that goes through this information, so I invite you to go to our website and learn more. Next slide. In addition, this is a slide with a lot of our free resources that are contained in our website. Please take a look. We try to put as much information as possible and be transparent so that you're able to go through these implementations easily. Next slide. Here are the next webinars we have scheduled in April. On April 22nd, we're going to have a town hall where we'll walk through some of our key initiatives and updates on our programs. And then at the end of April, we're going to have a collaborative webinar with X12 where we're going to walk through the 278 transaction, the standard, and also the operating rules. Next slide. And here's information about how to contact us. And importantly is our email, since if we did not get to your specific question or you want to learn a little bit more about how certification or recertification would impact your specific organization, please email us. I'd like to thank you so much for taking time out of your day to listen to this presentation, and I hope you have a great afternoon. Bye-bye.